Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. If you've read the title of this podcast, you're probably wondering how on earth does anyone accidentally run a 42-kilometer marathon? It's not something that people do accidentally. And when you look at marathon runners, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the kind of pro athlete level marathon runners who are doing it in the kind of 2-hour ballpark, or if you're looking at the people towards the end of a race doing it in 6 to 7 hours. Generally, there's a level of preparation involved. And of course, that's going to vary at the two extremes, but people just don't accidentally happen to run 42 kilometers. Not unless you magically have god-tier genetics and everything's right and there are perfect conditions. There is typically a level of training that is involved in running a marathon. So for me personally, running a marathon was never something I wanted to do. This year I've gotten more into running, but I never really wanted to run very long distances. The longest run I've done prior to today was 18 kilometers. And I didn't really go fast. I just kind of jogged along for 2 and a bit hours. And probably the fastest race I've ever done was the City to Surf, which is a 14-kilometer race in Sydney. And after that race, I had shin splints. So when I run, my kind of knees start to hurt. And I realized that for me personally, I'm not that interested in becoming this kind of super long distance runner. I'm really quite content with running 5 to 6 kilometers with my friends in the park a few times a week. And that's what I generally do. So how on earth does somebody who has no intention of running a marathon end up accidentally running a 42-kilometer marathon? Well, the story begins with a friend of mine who wanted to do the 10K Sydney Marathon. Now, the Sydney Marathon, of course, is a 42-kilometer race, but there are a number of sub-events. There is the half marathon, 21 kilometers, there is a 10-kilometer race, and there is a 3.5-kilometer family fun run. And people sign up for all of these events. And for us, the intention was to do the 10 kilometer. And for me, I was like, that's fine. I run 10 kilometers plenty of times. It wasn't something where I was trying to beat a record. It was just a fun day out. You're going to spend an hour and a bit running 10 kilometers. You're going to have breakfast and you're going to be back home by midday. So I thought it's kind of like a great Sunday. And the story of how I accidentally ran the marathon begins with arriving at this event. Now, we were recommended to arrive 1 hour beforehand, so it was a 6 a.m. start, and kind of the window to start your 10-kilometer race was between 6 and 6:30. And I was 15 minutes late. I probably got there at about 5:45, but we still had plenty of time. So my friend had been waiting for me, and then, she needed to go to the toilet. And in waiting to use the toilet, it probably took about half an hour. Those huge toilet queues. And when we got to the finish, like the start line, they basically said, sorry, you guys have missed the 10-kilometer race. We were 5 minutes late. We got to the start at 6:35. And in a moment where somebody says, you cannot run this race, and you've woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning to be there, and you've tried to do everything right, it's a very demoralizing thing. And it's happened to quite a few people. There were probably about 100 or 200 people who missed their 10-kilometer race because it was kind of a bit disorganized compared to the City to Surf, which I did earlier. Ideally there should have been something like a microphone telling people that the 10-kilometer race is about to end. And if you are running the 10-kilometer, please get to the start line so you can start your race. So we were told we couldn't do the 10. And they said, you can go to the customer service and speak to them. So we went to customer service and there was a whole line of people who'd missed the 10-kilometer race. And they basically told us, you have 3 options. Option 1 is you cannot run. And for me, I've woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Option 1 was never going to be an option. I was definitely going to run something. I'd spent $100. I'd woken up at 4 o'clock. I'd got into that park where we had to start off in Milsons Point, Sydney, and I was going to run. And they said, your other 2 options are, we can either change your event to the 3.5-kilometer family fun run or the full marathon, which happened to start after the 10K. And in that moment, I thought to myself, I've come all this way. The last thing I want to do is run 3.5 kilometers and go home. You're going to do the 42-kilometer. And I remember my friend was there with me and we had a few other people who were kind of all in the same situation. They'd missed the start of their 10-kilometer race. And I convinced a few people that we should do this. I said, look, think of it this way. even if you can't run the whole thing, do whatever you're going to do in the 10 kilometer and you can exit early. And for me, I said, well, if I'm going to do the 42 kilometer, I'm actually going to try and finish the marathon. Because for me, I reframed it. I said, look, this is actually a great opportunity. I'm somebody who never had the intention of doing a marathon, and all of a sudden I've been presented with the opportunity to do it. So I did it. And I remember I had this kind of like toxic positivity. But you realize when you're doing something like a marathon, you need that toxic positivity because it's all mental. And here's how my race went. So again, as I said, I've kind of run kind of short to medium distances. So for the first 2.5 hours, I basically jogged nonstop. And I got through maybe about 18 kilometers. And by about 6 kilometers, my shin splints had started. So I was kind of in pain for about 12 kilometers, but I kept going. And that was great because the way I saw it, it was a really hot day today in Sydney. We hit like 32, 33, 34 degrees, even in the city. And I knew that, well, you're not just running 10 kilometers. You're not doing a 1 kilometer race where you can kind of go fast. But it is important that you make as many kilometers earlier in the day when it is cooler, so you can take it a bit easier during the heat in the middle of the day. So that was kind of my very poorly thought out strategy. And so I did my first 18 kilometers where I jogged, and then I alternated between jogging and running. But what I started realizing as I was doing this is that because I was in so much pain when I jogged, my pace when I was walking was incredibly slow. And I realized I was holding myself back, and I got to maybe the 25 kilometer mark and I said, you know what, don't worry about trying to jog anymore. Because a common strategy for a lot of people running marathons is they alternate between running and jogging. But I already had this pre-existing injury from the City to Surf, from the last run I did a month or so ago, and it was making this a very difficult strategy to utilize. But what I realized is if I power walked, and I was trying to aim for, so 42 kilometers is roughly 26 miles, and if you've got like a Garmin watch, I think by default, maybe I just haven't changed the settings, it gives me all my measurements in miles. So I knew that if my pace was 14 minutes per mile, then roughly if I maintained that pace, I could do 4 miles in an hour, and based on the distance I'd already done, it would be another 2 hours until I finish, and I'd probably finish around the 6-hour mark. And I ended up finishing at 6 hours and 31 minutes. And it wasn't easy because even with power walking, I had this really fast pace initially for about 10 or so kilometers, and then I was cramping. My legs were cramping. I wasn't prepared. Remember, I wasn't prepared for this race. I didn't do any training up front. I didn't carb load. I didn't really have maybe the breakfast you would have had if you thought you were going to do a 42 kilometer race. There were some gels, which is like, it's kind of like a packet of sugar that they give you at the 20 kilometer mark. And so I had 3 of those. But otherwise, I was completely unprepared. The only thing that kept me going was these little milestones I made for myself. It was almost as I was running, I was like this, I was calculating how long is it going to take me? What's the best strategy? What pace do I need to be walking at to make sure I finish at a reasonable time? Because what happens is if you take longer than 7 hours to finish the course, you actually get kicked off. They don't allow anybody to finish after 7 hours. So there is a hard cutoff. You need to finish the marathon in that time frame. And as I said, the first 18 kilometers I jogged. For the next 7 kilometers, it was very difficult because I was trying to jog and run and I was in a lot of pain. And, jog and walk and alternate. And then even during the last 17 kilometers, so from 25 kilometers all the way to 42, where I was predominantly power walking, that was difficult because all my muscles were cramping up. My feet were sore. This is a longer distance than I've ever done. I've not walked 20 kilometers in a day. Okay, maybe I've walked 20 kilometers in a day. I'm sure I've done it. But have I jogged 18 kilometers before that? No, I haven't. So it was a very difficult thing to do. But I remember as I was walking, as I'm doing this marathon, as I'm jogging, walking, power walking, whatever, there was so much inspiration around me. There's a lot of people supporting you as you do this. There's a lot of they have volunteers holding signs saying you can do this. Quite literally, the kind of positive messages that people inundate themselves with every day. And more importantly, I was looking at the people around me who were also doing this marathon. And there were some incredible things I saw. I saw people in wheelchairs pushing themselves through it. I saw blind runners, which was incredible. They had guides, so they would have another runner who could see, who was kind of tied to them. So they had a little tie between the two so that the blind runner would know where the guide is. And sights like this are always incredible to see. And it's not that everyone in the world should go and do a marathon. Because, my God, if I had not accidentally had the opportunity to do a marathon, I would have had zero interest in doing one. But it's one of these things where when you think a particular path is hard, you will often be amazed by the other people who are taking this path. And you will realize that chances are you have it so much better than so many of these people. And these people were incredible. They were doing so much better than me. They were in so much better shape. And the other thing I really enjoyed was people were really positive during this marathon. They were helping each other out. Somebody almost saw my legs seize up and, we had a little conversation and we kind of kept pace for a couple of kilometers. And there was all these great kind of moments of human connection along that journey. But I think the most important thing, if I could take anything out of the story, it's when we were told we could not do the 10 kilometer, I was faced with two options. It was either don't run or do a 3.5 kilometer run, which is for me not impressive, or you have the option to do something amazing. And I said, I know I'm going to be a horrible marathon runner. I mean, I barely finished within the cutoff, right? I was about 29 minutes ahead of where I would have been disqualified from that race. But I'm somebody who hadn't trained for a marathon, and that's fine. But the important thing is, I was the hero of my own story. I was somebody who only intended to run 10 kilometers today, and for whatever reason, I 400x'd what I was expecting to do. I went from 10 kilometers to 42. And in doing that, it's all smiles. My body is in complete pain at the moment. But I remember when I got to the finish line, there was a guy I was power walking with, and he said, mate, you've got 20 meters left. And he was maybe a 60-year-old guy, and he'd done a few marathons before. And he said, do you want to try running for the last 20 meters? And I said, you know what? It's the last 20 meters, I'm going to give it a crack. And it's not even that impressive. It's 20 meters. There are people who know the finish line is 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers away, and that's when they start running. But I was in so much pain I couldn't do that. And I remember that 20 meters was the most painful 20 meters I've ever run in my life. I probably looked like Forrest Gump before he had the leg brace taken off. I was running with a bloody limp, and it probably wasn't even that fast. I would have potentially been better just power walking that last 20 meters. But the moral is, I was presented with two ways to view that situation. I could have been a victim of not being able to run the 10 kilometer and complain that, they didn't announce it, which is what a lot of people were doing. But I quickly abandoned that because I realized that was in the past. There is nothing I can do to get on the 10 kilometer race. And the only thing I focused on was what I had to do in the future, the 42. And as I did the 42, I found every single positive thing I could find to motivate me along the way. Because I'd never done a race that big. So in my head, I said, well, okay, after I finished the 3.5, I said, okay, I've done the family fun run. When I got to 10 kilometers, I said, okay, cool, I've done what I came to do. When I got to 21, I said, cool, I finished the half marathon. And then from there onwards, I created little milestones. So you got to 30 and you got to 35. And when I got to 38, I said, you've got 6 kilometers left. And then when I did the next kilometer, I said, you've got 5 left. This is something you do all the time, and 4, and so on and so forth. So I created these hundreds of little milestones, from the numbers that were the kilometers that were left, to the miles that were being recorded on my smartwatch, to the sights I was seeing. I was trying to remember things I'd done in these places in Sydney. And so I found every source of dopamine and positivity that I could latch onto. And I made the goals so small that I was somehow able to finish a 42 kilometer marathon. And so faced with the option of complaining, feeling like a victim, versus becoming the hero of my own story, today I chose to become the hero of my own story. Now, my time isn't impressive, but what is impressive is the options I chose and the way I faced it mentally. I decided to go into that marathon with a positive mindset, not a mindset. And look, I'm sure there were people who decided to do the 42, but maybe they had a mindset where they were angry that they didn't get to do the 10. And I'm not sure how those people fared, but it always helps to have maybe a unhealthy amount of positivity, because what I've realized is it takes you so much further than being negative. And with that, I will end this episode here. That's the story of how I accidentally ran my first marathon. And I wish everyone listening to this great success on all your endeavors. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favourite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.